Good evening, everyone. I'm Billy. I'm an alcoholic. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for being here tonight. Um, Jimmy is here as well. Get a few things out of the way. Um, Number one, if you have your camera on and your phone comes up to the screen, you will be removed from the meeting and not allowed back in. We have 5 people watching. Um, if you don't attend our Monday night workshop, usually it's no big deal. I'm sure there's much better things to do, but I'll just explain our rule. It's the opposite of a 3-strike policy. It's a no-strike policy. So if you lift your phone up into camera view, you're just removed permanently from the meeting because we have to protect people's anonymity. The recording of this, I believe in full transparency, the recording of this will be absolutely made. There will be a number put in to join a WhatsApp group if you would like. That number will be put in a little while. You can send a WhatsApp message if you're in the Monday night Facebook group, the private group for the Monday night service workshop. The recording will be in there as well. Questions later on will be sent in by chat. Then I will read them and Jimmy or I will answer them to get a couple of things out of the way because there are a lot of people here. We are not here tonight to discuss any single one word that might happen to be in the 4th edition or 5th edition of the Big Book. That's much better somewhere else, like your district or your area. That's the place for that discussion. But I think the one thing Jimmy and I probably, we know, we've talked to each other, have in common the last couple of weeks is how many questions we have received. And then based on how many questions, how much bad information is out there. Now, I have already attended multiple report backs that were available virtually. But I'm talking about just people who call with questions. And probably the highest level question is, believe it or not, from people who say, I thought they couldn't change this. And so there will be a couple of slides to show tonight. The answer is no, we're not sharing the slides because they come right from conference approved literature. So I'm a big fan of, instead of telling people, showing people where to find their own information. So whatever I refer to off that slide, I will tell you where it is in the book. And if you would like to go and rip it out of the book and bring it to your next assembly or whatever you would like to do with it, that's totally your business. But we're not going to get in the business of passing out slides, and it's very minimal slides. Any chat messages that are ugly or out of context or anything like that, we'll have the same rule about phones. Tonight is about process. And because this is a complicated matter of something that doesn't happen a lot, there's some important questions about process or information to make sure you know where to look for it. That does not mean I'm trying to tell anybody they can't ask hard questions wherever you are in AA. It's how you ask them, not can you ask them. The number one complaint writer to the board in the history of Alcoholics Anonymous is the author of the Big Book, if you didn't know that. The AA archives are filled with Bill's letters when he did not agree with the board. So obviously there's nothing wrong with disagreeing with anybody, whether it's the board, the conference, whoever. Sometimes you're going to agree, sometimes you're going to disagree. In fact, I'm sure I'm going to have friends of mine tonight all be mad at me. So that's just the lot we take in AA service. But we do want to get some important information out there. So I am going to ask, just hold on one second to start off in the right place. I want to bring a slide up of why we got here, or what seems to have set a lot of people off that called me. And that is the old is no conference action is binding on another conference. And what started it all off is this memo, which a lot of you have. You can get it from your delegate. It was sent out in April of 2002. This is what the fellowship received. This is why a lot of people, I guess, I'm not saying I agree with them, but a lot of people feel like, wow, I can't believe this happened. But if you read that memo from the Trustees Literature Committee, it talks about the advisory action to create the fifth edition and says very clearly the first 164 pages of the big book, Alcoholics Anonymous, the preface, the forwards, the doctor's opinion, Dr. Bob's nightmare, and the appendixes will remain as is. So that's kind of going as far back as you can as to when the fellowship first heard information in kind of a mass communication besides just their individual delegate. If you don't have that memo, you request the memo of October 31st of 2022. You should easily be able to ask your delegate. Now, other things that have been said to me or asked questions about is prior delegates that didn't go to this year's conference have been making that same promise of the 2022 letter that no changes will be made. So that's kind of where, as far back as I can see, people who've asked me questions are pointing to about why they were surprised. So whether they were or not, whether they should be, whether they should know the service manual better is probably a good question. But I do want to, if you could go to slide 4, please, the conference charter. So there is the conference charter, the current conference charter in the service manual on page 123. And what we're really talking about is the last paragraph in Article 3. But no change in Article 12 of the charter, which is Concept 12, or in the 12 traditions of AA, or in the 12 steps of AA may be made with less than the written consent of 3/4 of the AA groups as described in the resolution adopted by the 1955 conference and convention. That resolution is also in the service manual, right after the conference charter. So a lot of people, I guess, were under the wrong impression that the big book needed 75%. That is absolutely not true. I've heard people losing their minds over this. And, I think it's so unfair to the people who are at the conference this year, the voting members, that people are like saying this stuff like it's in black and white in the service manual. The big book, the first 164, is not protected. So let's go to the no conference action is binding on another conference action. Sometimes that gets taken out of context. Sometimes people think that means you don't have to listen to what last year's conference did. That is not what it means in the context of Alcoholics Anonymous service. What it means is if a new conference votes 2/3 to do it differently, then the old action is not binding upon them. But until there's a 2/3 advisory action changing what the old conference decided to do, that is the group conscience of Alcoholics Anonymous of the United States and Canada. So I would suggest that, get together, have service manual studies. I would say do anything except have service sponsee only service manual studies, because those are kind of destroying Alcoholics Anonymous and creating like caucuses and political action committees of like people who all vote the same way. Have a service manual study and invite whoever. Let everybody come. So, but I just want to be clear there on the conference charter. Jimmy, do you have anything you want to add on the conference charter? I'm going to unmute you right now. Go ahead.
Hey, everybody. Jimmy Dean, alcoholic. Glad to be here. Just the parts in the Article 3 before what you referenced at the end, where it talks about the relationship between the conference body and the Fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous, voting as its conscience dictates, but also, I would say, uh, free to decide which questions should be taken to the group level for information, discussion, or their own direct instruction. Thanks.
Thank you very much for that. So with that, I want to go to concept 3. And for the person doing the slides, if you could go to slide number, let me open my service manual. Oh, before I go to concept 3, I want to go to this. Probably the reason we're all here tonight is because if you do go to a service manual study, you will find Appendix W, W for William. It's on page 173. That appendix is how the conference operates. It's all of one page back and front, or 2 pages. I want to stress again, the service manual is not a policy document. And it's written to be a descriptive document in general to help a new GSR learn service. It's not supposed to be something you run up to the microphone with to call someone out of line with, okay? It's an overall policy description, the front of it, not the concepts, just the front of it. And there's a lot of things like that that probably many people who have not served as a delegate or as a trustee or a director do not know. A perfect example is there's a section of the service manual that talks about how do we elect a regional trustee? How do we elect the chair of the general service board? How do we elect a general service trustee? How do we elect a trustee at large? The nominating committee actually has nominating procedures that start with nominating procedure number 1 and go up into the teens, maybe the early 20s. So for every one of those sections of the service manual about how do we elect somebody or how do we do this, there's an actual policy document that really literally describes every step of the process. Same with the conference. So this, how the conference operates, is nice in general, but we're going to see how there are certain things in the service manual that maybe people misconstrued or read literally, and so we're unaware that certain things could happen. So now let me go to concept 3. And I'm a big believer in concept 3. I'm sure Jimmy will chime in after me that he is. No organization can have leaders that can't make decisions. And I have total respect for not only the sacrifice the current delegates and board members make, because they sacrifice a ton of their life for the fellowship. So I have total respect for that. And I have respect that they have to make decisions that we could never make. The question, I think, once you do your research after hearing all this information is, when is it legitimate to use that right of decision and when is it not? And that's a healthy conversation. But one of the things I heard recently on a virtual report back was that a delegate can't be instructed. So I just want to clear up that little urban myth. Concept 3 is very clear on this. Is it a good idea to instruct your delegate? No. Would we pretty much stop all progress in Alcoholics Anonymous service if we started instructing delegates? Yes. But you can't go so far as saying that an area can't instruct a delegate when the concept says the exact opposite. In the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5th paragraph of concept 3, it says, for example, knowing that theirs is the final authority, the groups are sometimes tempted to instruct the delegates exactly how to vote upon certain matters in the conference. Because they hold the ultimate authority, there is no doubt that the AA groups have the right to do this. I just want to read that again. There is no doubt that the AA groups have the right to do this. If they insist, They can give directives to their delegate on any and all AA matters. So I want to make clear, I'm not saying it's a good idea. I would never want to stop AA progress and service, but I also don't want to misquote AA literature or somehow point a new GSR or somebody in the wrong direction. I want to point them in the direction of our conference approved literature, which I believe is the great unifier. So that being said, before I turn it over to Jimmy on concept 3, I want to go to the second to last paragraph of concept 3. The right of decision should never be made an excuse for failure to render proper reports of all significant actions taken. It ought never be used as a reason for constantly exceeding a clearly defined authority, nor as an excuse for persistently failing to consult those who are entitled to be consulted before an important decision or action is taken. So a couple of things to say from a high level. And I'm just passing on questions that were passed on to me. A GSR called me and said that they heard at a recent report back that certain things at the General Service Conference were confidential. So I want to get that little myth out there. The General Service Conference is not a legal entity or legal body. That's why the concepts spell out the difference between the bylaws of the General Service Board being a legal document, and even Concept 7 quotes the charter of the General Service Board, which is not in the manual, by the way. And if that's been driving you crazy, that was old lingo for a certificate of incorporation. So in Concept 7, when it says the bylaws of the General Service Board and the charter are legal documents, that's the first certificate of incorporation filed, then there's a current certificate of incorporation filed. The conference charter is a spiritual document. It has no legal authority whatsoever. It's a handshake agreement between the trustees and the groups, exercised through their delegates, that if the conference decides to do something by a 2/3 substantial unanimity, that it's an advisory action that the trustees have to follow. But nothing there is confidential. There's no confidential section when they're debating things at the General Service Conference. And I know because I've been to a few of them, like your home group, I'm sure sometimes people say things they wish they didn't say after they go to the diner that night and realize, wow, did I really say that? I'm sure. So when everybody's pointing fingers always back at the conference or at the board or even the godforsaken term New York, which I can't stand as a New Yorker because most of the people there are not from New York. So it drives me crazy when people always blame New York. And I'm like, there's no New Yorkers there. There's like 10 New Yorkers and everyone else is from the rest of the country. But those debates are not confidential. This is so serious a topic that when there has been serious legal issues going on in Alcoholics Anonymous, the board has had to explain to the conference that the reason they can't know attorney-client privilege information is because they're not part of any legal entity. They can get high-level information, but they're not part of a legal entity that the attorneys represent. So I just want to make sure that that's out there. And, you know, all I can say, I've had a delegate, a GSR, tell me that their delegate won't tell them how they voted. That's really none of my business, but it's the business of your area. That's a good topic to bring up at your area. Do you expect the delegate to come back and disclose how they voted? That's 100% up to your area. The way I read Concept 3, full transparency is required from the General Service Conference. And I actually think, and this is where some of my friends are going to hate me, I actually think sometimes that when a delegate, and I'm not talking about the issue we're talking about tonight with the big book, but let's just say something that was on the agenda. that background information went out about. And your area talked about it and talked about it and had a real clear way they were going to go. And your delegate heard new information that changed their mind. They believe if you heard that, you would have taken the action they're going to take. That's the best learning lesson of concept 3. For a delegate to come back and say, I know how most of you felt on this, but this is the way I voted this way. This is what concept 3 is all about. But it is a good discussion if there are people saying that they don't have to disclose how they voted, for your area to set an expectation of who you elect as delegate. You have a right to set expectations for who you send to the conference. The other thing I'll say about the right of decision and then turn it over to Jimmy is this. Somebody said something else to me recently who called me with questions. The right of decision is not something that is given to you because of a title. It's not in the job description of trustee, director, or delegate that one of the things you get for holding that position is the right of decision. That's not how it works. The right of decision is given to people to carry out a delegated authority from the people who have the ultimate authority. So for trustees, they have a lot of flexibility in right of decision, but the gift, the right, is given to them by the General Service Conference. There's no one in AA that doesn't report to an ultimate group conscience. So the same, with delegates and the same, inside your area, that, this right of decision, it's not in the delegate job description. It's something that you actually give your delegate as representative of your groups. So Jimmy, go ahead on concept 3.
Hey, yeah, thank you, Billy. So when you pointed out that exercising the right of decision in no way means that we don't accurately and fully report the results of a discussion that ended up in some form of a decision. I have also fielded questions around calling confidentiality reasons for not, I don't mean using people's names and telephone numbers, but confidentiality as it relates to the source of different pieces of material, or maybe some background that found its way into a committee. So there is, I think the highest level of the execution of the right of decision, the way I heard it when I was new, is sometimes the most powerful use of that right is deciding that you should not decide. That punning to the higher authority is to seek a broader conscience around matters of vital importance to the fellowship is part and parcel of this particular concept. Again, a spiritual principle, and all based around the second tradition. I always think about looping in trusted servant, the description of a trusted servant. It takes one of us to do the serving, but all the rest of us need to do the trusting. And in order to do that, we have to feel like we have, skin in the game, and that all of the processes are both inbound and outbound. When the processes are all outbound, it doesn't look familiar to us as AA members. And I think that's why these particular concepts are put in place for us, right? I'm not saying that when I was on the board, multiple times I remember that the scope of the conversation in the first 5 or 10 minutes fell to whether or not we had the right to decide. and what the implication of that decision would be. What was our sense of urgency, right? Where was the urgency in the particular question that was being posed at that moment in time? And you know, the phrase that I think is out there on the AA airwaves, which is whether or not we're moving at the speed of trust, right? Was the decision made because we felt like whatever that decision happened to be, that we felt like that there was grievous injury expected to the movement by not taking the action, and that question I think is probably any trusted servant benefits from the weight of their constituency, and that weight doesn't mean that you know they're antagonistic or angry or belligerent, or you know Bill would call it the tyranny of the minority. It's just about hearing, about having conversation. Uh, Unusual climate in Alcoholics Anonymous when any disagreement is perceived as anger rather than passion. There are a lot of passionate people in Alcoholics Anonymous, and every voice Bill thought needed to be heard as often as possible. So that's what I think I can add. Thanks.
Thank you, Jimmy. Just a quick announcement. We did go over 500 people in here. It's now below 500, thank God. But if you know someone, um, I'm sure they have a resentment, and we have a book for that actually. So, but this is being recorded. Um, it'll be checked to make sure that none of us use any last names before the recording goes out. But the recording will be available. So I want to turn now to one of those places in the service manual that doesn't match what happened at the conference. Now, I'm not saying that's bad. I already said the service manual is descriptive. It's supposed to be in general. But it is what we tell our GSRs and everybody to study. And so, from a high level, I'm sure most here know, the 12 and 12 was changed by floor action at this past conference. The Big Book was not. The Big Book, it was a recommendation out of the Literature Committee that was passed by substantial unanimity by the conference. So I'm just going to ask to please, if you don't have questions, please do not send in chat messages to any of the three co-hosts at this time. Okay, so there is a third way, but it's not talked about in the service manual. In fact, the opposite is talked about. It doesn't mean it's never happened before, but the Literature Committee entertained a piece of new business that was not on the agenda and voted in favor of it and presented it as a recommendation. So let's go to page 41 of the service manual. Process and procedures in the General Service Conference section. And it's being brought up on the screen if you need to look at it, if you don't have the service manual handy. But what does it say? The beginning of the week primarily concerns the conference committees meeting to discuss and vote on their agenda items. Now, I didn't write that. I'm sure I looked at it at one time. I was a director or a trustee and on a trustees committee. But it's very clear there. Someone called me with this question. And in fact, I didn't have a service manual and I was in the middle of something when they called me and I was like, I said, I got to look that up. I don't want to comment. But they're right. The beginning of the week primarily concerns the conference committees meeting to discuss and vote on their agenda items. So maybe somebody in this audience wants to send in a conference agenda item this year to Maybe make sure the procedure that was used this year is actually in the service manual, because when you go down to floor actions, two sections below on the same page, what does it say? The committees are not the only source of recommendations for body to consider and vote on. During the general sessions, members may make recommendations directly from the floor that may not have passed through a particular conference committee. They are known as floor actions. So it talks about two paths in the service manual for something to get to the conference floor. It talks about something that's on a committee's agenda that was sent out with background, and it talks about a floor action. Now, it's long been accepted that committees can, the reason that we translate background. There's one from a couple of years ago. And I think people who've been to the conference knew this, but many people who have not been to the conference, who have called with questions, were very surprised that a committee could do this because it's not in the service manual. It's not in the process and procedures. And I'm not saying whether that's right or wrong, but I am saying this is kind of like a group inventory. There's no way to do business in this little virtual session tonight. Like at a group inventory, you don't do business or motions there. Maybe you take some information and you come back to your next business meeting and you make a motion. Maybe there should be, I don't know. Should there be a proposed agenda item to maybe better clarify that the process that was used is okay? Um, Jimmy, do you want to talk about that?
About the committee system.
Yeah, about the committee being able to make a recommendation on something that was not on there.
Well, a legitimate example, I was a panel 59 delegate and I chaired the Grapevine Committee. And in 2010, we created a new agenda item around taking that survey of the fellowship around, uses of the Grapevine in Lavinia, the relevance of the magazines, etc. But it was my understanding historically, I don't think I'm making any of this up, that most new agenda items, and there aren't many that I've ever been aware of, most new agenda items source in the discussion that the committee is having around their existing items and or quote unquote new business. But it's rare. Back in the day, and you were delegate long before me, but even in my time, we were not counseled, but we were told that that was not necessarily the best idea to bring something new as a recommendation out of committee because none of your other fellow delegates would have any background information on any of that at all, right? The 8 or 9 of you would be aware, but it would be a brand new item when it was introduced on the floor of the conference as a committee recommendation. Now, whether that process or procedure is impacted by that, I'm not sure. But again, I think the word urgency comes to mind. I realize it's not in the Secret Service Manual, any of this, but it would be around a sense of urgency in most instances. And certainly the floor action process has been used liberally every year that I've ever attended a general service conference. We've always had them. So I am I'm unsure about how, if this was going to be something that would be even semi-normal, I would think mentioning it in the description of the committees in the service manual would be important, right? It's a missing piece as to how the conference could receive, new business. Yeah.
Thank you. One of the things that I'm often not surprised by is sometimes I think, and I'm pointing the finger at myself, not anyone else, but sometimes there is a spiritual disease, illness, whatever, that when you go down the upside down triangle, you might have blinders on sometimes. And you don't think other people really understand what's going on at the conference. But my experience is the opposite. That's what I've learned, is that many people do understand and they read everything they can get their hands on. And some of the questions that I've received, I mean, I've thought like, wow, sometimes we think that like we don't, have enough really active GSRs or people, but we do. We have a lot of people who love Alcoholics Anonymous, and some of them are very, very well read. Um, and so I'm not here to say that what the literature committee did this year was wrong because they're allowed to do it. The question for the fellowship is going to be, should it be clearer spelled out in the service manual that a conference committee has this authority, this power to do this, so that everybody knows they have that authority? Or does the fellowship feel maybe they shouldn't anymore? But that's up to the fellowship, not anyone else. Um, it's, an important question for sure. But most of the people I run into had no idea that a conference committee was allowed to make only mostly people who have served at the conference know this. So the next thing I want to go to is another great question I was asked. And so I said to the person, you know what? We'll use it when we do this. And I did think I will take a quick break to let you all know that I think today's daily reflection is awesome and a good reminder for all of us that we are only operating a spiritual kindergarten. So, good reminder for all of us. That's June 24th today. But I want to go to the slide with the timeline, please. Thank you. So, this is a question I received, and I think a really good one. And I think it's important for everybody to understand that the 75th General Service Conference was last year, over a year ago. And after that 75th General Service Conference, the window of time to submit a proposed agenda item for the next General Service Conference was still open for a few months. If you look at the timeline, it goes the conference and to September. You could submit a proposed agenda item. After that date in September, you would not be able to submit for the 76th General Service Conference. It would fall over to the 77th. You missed the deadline. And so the person who asked me this question, I think it's a good one, and again, it's one for the fellowship to discuss and talk about, is I don't know your percentage. I think I know mine. But the percentage of people in AA who know that there even is a deadline for proposed agenda items to the General Service Conference in September is a pretty low percentage. If you're going to go to your local clubhouse or to your local home group or wherever and ask every person coming out, do you know the deadline of the General Service Conference proposed agenda items? That's not a piece of information that a lot of people know. Many people know it, but a lot of people, especially those not involved in general service, do not. Who is allowed to make a recommendation or bring up a piece of new business? Out of the 2 million people in AA, or so, give or take, 9 people. If you read in the service manual how a conference committee operates, it's the members of that committee are the voting and participating members. There is a staff member who serves as the conference committee secretary. That person does not have a vote and usually is not participating in the discussion or debate. They are there to be the secretary. They're there to get information for the committee if the committee needs information from somewhere else at GSO or, some history document because they're trying to make a decision. But it's those area delegates in that room. And as a bunch of people, called me with questions, is that yes, it's pretty hard for me to honestly say that none of the people in that room did not know the deadline. Like that's one place in AA where 100% of the room knew the deadline in September. Unlike any other place in AA you could ever ask that question. 100%. And so why was this not submitted as a proposed agenda item? That's a question for the fellowship to decide, and the person who called me for them to decide, to talk about with their delegate. Why was this not submitted prior to September, especially by someone who knew the deadline date? So that background could have went out and it could have been discussed by the groups. And let me just freely say, I don't run into anyone, very few, very few, who debate this action the conference took as far as the word. It's all about the process and the description of the process in the service manual and the lack of process for it not going out as an agenda item. And that unless new information is brought, but even if you're a trustee who's called into a conference committee meeting, you have to be requested by the conference committee. You can't be a trustee and just say, I want to go in there and see what they're up to. No, that's their meeting. And if they think they need the general manager of GSO to ask a few questions, or the publishing director, or the chair of the trustees literature committee, that's up to that conference committee. But the only people in that room who are making decisions and who have the ability to make something a new business item are the conference delegates that are on that committee. So again, that's something that the conference is going to have to decide is, do they want 9 people having that ability to put something on the agenda without going through the process? So the other thing, it's another good question. I just wanted to, if you could go to the slide with the percentages, then I'm going to turn it over to Jimmy for. I'm just waiting for the slide on the percentages. Maybe they do not hear me. I guess they do not hear me. And oh, here we go. The percentages, the circles, the voting members. Yes, right there. So this was another question that a very great, I think, DCM or alternate DCM asked. And I think it's a really good question, since this was kind of an emergency, urgent action that was taken by the conference. In that, what percentage of the people who decided it was an emergency this year were there last year? And so if you don't understand how the General Service Conference works, just so I can make it easy for you, is we had a big trustee rotation last year. So only about 60% of the trustees were there this year that were there last year. Half of the directors, half of the delegates, and about 80% of the staff. So about 55% of the people who voted to take emergency action this year were there last year. And so the DCM who called me was like, wasn't this word in the book last year? Like, how come these same people weren't so bothered by this word last year? It's not like this was new information. And so that's a question for the groups and the fellowship to decide. Again, about process going forward. We should always be focused on the solution, not calling each other names, not being ugly. Um, and by the way, just my personal 2 cents, and you could write me an email and tell me to get lost, but the power of the purse was not created to appeal conference advisory actions. You have a way to do with that. You could send in a new proposed agenda item. You can put it back on the discussion. But I have seen some like really harsh comments, like that's our group conscience as it sticks today. The unity of Alcoholics Anonymous depends on us supporting the group conscience, even if you don't like it, because we have tools to change it. And the service manual maybe needs to be clearer about the third option, the way something can get on the agenda. I didn't think that person was right, but when I read my service manual a couple of times, I was like, they are correct. This is not talked about in the service manual at all. It's agenda items that went out on the agenda or floor action. That's what you get from reading the service manual. No mention that a conference committee can put new business on, even though I know they can. But I'm not a good example. The new GSR, the new DCM, the people who are on fire for service, who are getting together in service manual studies, they would not know that by reading the service manual. So, Jimmy, you want to talk about a little bit about uh, the last two slides, if you could just give a couple of comments.
Yeah. On the makeup of the conference or the what
Yeah, about how many people were there the year before, and that it's not a whole new set of people that were there this year.
right. Well, again, part of the benefit of having staff members that certainly they rotate their assignments, but we should all be aware that you're employed, say, 25 years at GSO. There aren't many that can last that long, but if you're 25 years as a staff member at GSO, you've attended 25 general service conferences, right? Actively participated in all those conferences. And that institutional memory and experience has been extraordinarily beneficial to the conference itself. From a historical point of reference, people that have been involved in it over time. Same thing with trustees, much shorter period of service, but you've got up to 4 years as a Class B trustee, alcoholic trustee, 6 years as a non-alcoholic trustee. You've got 8 years in as a conference member if you were a non-trustee director and served all 4 years as that in that role. Then another 4 years as a general service trustee, and so those experiences are very important. I think the conference committee resources that you touched on about people being invited into the committee and then invited out of the committee as soon as they've given the information that's been requested is really important. I would think that through the committee orientation or the delegate chair orientation process, that all conference committee chair people are well aware that any and all resources are available to help the committee while it's involved in its discussion prior to making these recommendations, because they're setting policy, right? It's not that the recommendation is always going to be approved. Oftentimes, the conference does not get to 2/3 to approve a recommendation, but they're setting policy. And again, as you said when we first started, Any conference advisory action is policy until a future conference rescinds that or modifies or amends what was done. We've got stuff from back in the 50s and 60s that's never been amended or rescinded, and it's still policy. And sometimes you've got to get multiple staff members to go back into the data banks in order to pull all that stuff out. There's a lot of institutional memory in 55%, right? There's been a lot of experience with the fifth edition book. I realize we're talking about our process and procedures, but the draft of that book has been available to multiple conferences over the past since 2020. I came off in 23, so since 2022, I think, or 2023, there were pieces, right? So I'm sorry, I conflated plain language.
That's
Re-
okay.
Sorry, retract
That's all
that.
right.
Yeah.
I want you to talk about the timeline in a second, about the period of time that this could have been added to the agenda. But before we do that, there is a place in the service manual. I see it now. It doesn't match the other place in the service manual, so I hope this can be addressed in the future. So, process and procedures and how the conference operates says the committee members meeting to discuss and vote on their agenda items, period. That's it. Ends right there. In the conference committee section of the service manual, there is a section that says they can address the agenda items as they are, modify them, and even consider new agenda items. So page 44 does not match page 41. If the person who asked me that question is not on here tonight, I will be reaching out to you to make sure that you take a look at that other page. But it's an awesome question that you asked, and the pages don't match. So good for you. I hope you play like late night service manual trivia at whatever regional events you go to, because you would be awesome that you noticed that and how the conference operates, but it does not match the conference committee section. So Jimmy, could you talk about the time period between the old conference and September and then the deadline for proposed agenda items?
Sure. Right now, September 30th is our deadline, right? So as soon as the conference closed in 2025, so the Saturday that conference, the board met and the conference officially closed, then the next year's conference was beginning from the perspective of the conference coordinator at GSO, beginning to receive items. Those items are coming into the office to the conference coordinator's desk first. And then there are three people, at least there were through April of 2023. There are three people that receive a copy of the proposed agenda item, and they determine where it's routed either to a trustees committee or to a corporate board. And those items are what are setting the agendas of the trustee committees and going on the corporate board agendas for their meetings in either June for the corporate boards or July, end of July for the corporate boards again, and or the general service board. So as those items come forward, they're being added to that grid that all sitting delegates and past delegates are intimately familiar with. And there are announcements that I believe are made in most areas around the fact that there is a submission deadline of September the 30th, and that gives the office ample time to pull together background material for every agenda item for trustees, and then certainly that same background material forwards on to the conference committee as their agenda is being built by these items that are being submitted. So the conference process is months long, and the deadline is certainly earlier. Was as a result of the EDW process, which I believe has been rescinded as of this year. But it's it's a timeline that has always appeared to be more than adequate, although a tremendous number of items, I think, historically come in the 30 or 45 days prior to the deadline. Most drunks think about it and then finally see on the calendar that the deadline is approaching and get something in there, right? But plenty of time,
I
ample
just
time.
need to make an emergency announcement that 3 people are about to be removed for cameras, phones that are in view of their camera. If you are one of those people, you are going to be removed in like 3 seconds. So I just got like 5 messages. Anonymity is super important. I just want to repeat that. The recording will be made available. It will not be edited at all unless there is a last name that happens to come out of one of our mouths that we didn't mean to say. That is the only edit that will happen on this recording. So to the person who asked the question, yes. The person who brought it up in the room had the ability to send in an agenda item prior to September 30th. And most delegates know that date. If that had happened, it would have gone onto the conference agenda, background would have went out, and it would have been discussed in your areas. I'm going to go to some questions. Jimmy? Let's see. When do they vote to make changes about a previous conference item? In other words, how does it really work with no conference is bound by past conference actions? So the way it works is you need to have a new agenda item that gets sent out with the agenda that the committee can talk about and then make a new recommendation to the floor, or somebody could make a floor action.
Yeah. And there's also the times where the conference determines that something is of enough importance where it reaffirms a prior conference advisory action.
Thank you. And Jimmy,
Add emphasis.
could you answer this question? What would need to be done to create an action item that would require a floor action to just be placed on the agenda for the next year by default, so it's not dealt with in an urgent way?
I think that would be a process suggestion that would go in as a proposed agenda item and would live in the conference policy and admissions committee. And it would affect, of course, how the conference operates. So that document would also be modified as well. But the conference, of course, approves how the conference operates. That's their first item of business every year. The conference approves by vote how they're going to conduct their business in that particular conference. But it would be a modification of that document and also an item to be discussed in the policy and admissions committee.
Thank you. So for the person who asked it, if this is something you or your group thinks, as Jimmy said, send in a proposed agenda item and it'll eventually get routed to the policy and admission committee. What if I send in a PAI to reopen discussion and it is not forwarded to the conference, like the preamble? Jimmy?
Well, this has been discussed in some detail for at least since I was delegate and before I was delegate. So when items are submitted, as I said, they go to the conference coordinator in New York, who logs the item, numbers it, and then the conference coordinator, the director of staff services, and the chair of the trustees committee on the conference determine best routing for that item. And when I say routing, that means, does it go to AWS or the A Grapevine board for discussion? Does it go to one of the trustees committees? And it becomes an item on that board or committee agenda the next time that they meet. Now, they may table the item the first time they meet, but everything's got to get handled by January latest, and almost everything gets handled in October. But the trustees committee is going to have a discussion around the item to determine if there is expressed need, if it's something that perhaps might possibly conflict with an AA principle, in other words, a tradition or a concept. And then in certain instances, there have been questionable reasons for rejection of an item. I would say that perhaps the explanation that was given to the submitter of the item, the submitter didn't feel that it was ample, that it was clear. There have in the past been items that have been submitted with greater endorsement. In other words, endorsement of a district, endorsement of a group, endorsement of an area, endorsement of multiple areas, and rarely, but sometimes those items have been rejected as well. I would just encourage anyone who submits to have as many AA voices behind the item as they can, because that one person can certainly submit the greatest idea, but it shows that there's a broader and broader conscience that's behind whatever the proposed item happens to be.
So there's a couple of questions around this topic. There's questions about people who submitted a censure and it didn't go to the conference, people who submitted about the preamble and it didn't go to the conference. And then one person actually said, I'm not even going to say what they said to me, but they said the reason that they're using the power of the purse is not because they disagree with advisory actions. It's because they find that the current General Service Board will not send items to the conference. And so they have no other alternative but to exercise the power of the purse because they can't even get a discussion around the item. Now, it is important to point out, and I hope everybody reads the final conference report. I hope everybody goes to the delegate report back. I hope everybody asks lots of questions because the agenda selection process is something that's going to be talked about in the future. So please make sure that you are participating.
And I would say that I'm aware of many AA entities, groups, districts, certain other AA entities that I believe are exercising the power of the purse for that specific reason as well. The percentages of items that are submitted by the fellowship that actually make it to the conference agenda have been declining precipitously over the past few years. And not even that they would be suggested by some other item. And as far as the censure is concerned, that's an interesting, I guess, rabbit hole we wouldn't fall down tonight, but one of the concepts states that the trustees don't get to grade their own performance. And that's kind of an interesting thing to gatekeep a motion to censure, right? Where its home or destination needs to be. Not to overtalk it, and Billy, you know more about the history than I do, but I recall, and I have somewhere in paper form, a couple of hundred pages of background that Amy pulled when she was archivist around how this process kind of floated away from the conference agenda committee. About 3 or 4 years after Bill died, it began to change and kind of just kept changing from that point forward.
Yep. Thank you very much for throwing that out. I did mention somebody wrote in about the finance committee. Yes, they changed. There was a Spanish-speaking delegate on the conference finance committee. Every year, the official word back was that we couldn't afford to translate background into Spanish and French. There was a delegate on the conference finance committee. he was upset that, forget the background, the agendas and the stuff that we get every year wasn't even translated for him. And so he brought a motion, he brought a piece of new business to his committee. And because it was always about cost, the finance committee felt that fell to them. And they are the ones that made the recommendation to the conference floor that we do translate background into Spanish and French. So as I said earlier, that did come from the finance committee. Here's a great question. I love this question from a GSR. Do we keep records of votes at the conference? Can we get a voting record of somebody? Nope, it's not like C-SPAN. We don't have a ticker. We don't, give you votes by person, by delegate. Nope, we do not have that. Jimmy, this person asks, why is it not a bigger deal to have background info for the floor actions? I guess, or not have background.
Well, some of the floor actions, if you review them, some of the floor actions are an attempt to resurrect an item that failed or was not recommended out of a committee. So the committees are going to report back to the full conference, and each report, if it contains a recommendation, then that means it's a motion and a second for the conference to discuss, debate, and then ultimately vote up or down. And then the conference committee also has the ability to take no action on a particular item on their agenda. And oftentimes in either one of those outcomes, a member of the conference feels that the item is of such importance that it should be resurrected in the form of a floor action. Other floor actions normally have come with some type of historical reference to them. But something that's a floor action, and I only speak to my experience, if it's a floor action and it's let's say a brand new piece of material, oftentimes the conference will quickly vote to decline to consider, I think for two reasons. Number one, because they don't have any background information around the item, so no history from what has perhaps been discussed or decided in the past. And number two, as or more importantly, delegates have not had an opportunity to visit with their areas around it. So they don't feel like they're as informed as they should be before they make the decision.
Thank you. There's a question here. Is the PA selection process fair to determine what PAIs are chosen to be brought to the fellowship? Is it compromised? Can we trust? That's not a question for us here tonight. I mean, there's 500 people here tonight. That's a question to bring to your delegate at your area, at your district meeting. That's the proper place to bring that question, to ask them. There's another question here, which is a really good one, which we probably don't talk about enough, but I'm glad somebody asked it. There is a person I attend district meetings with who is very upset by this decision. While I agree with them, I am disheartened by how they talk to other people, name calling, and other behavior. So I want to get this out there, because if you're new to service, I'm just going to tell you, this is a lesson that you have to learn. There is nothing wrong with disagreeing in AA. If you are aligning yourself with people who are name calling, who are ugly, who are condescending, or anything like that, I'm going to tell you, nothing you put forward is going to go forward, because you are going to be put in the same bucket as them. I'm just telling you. Like, this is Alcoholics Anonymous. We can all handle it like grown-ups. But name calling and ugly comments just have no place in Alcoholics Anonymous. And I'm just telling you, you're shooting yourself in the foot if you're aligning yourself with people like that, because no one is ever, I always said at the General Service Conference, sometimes somebody will say something, and I'm talking about at the conference, okay? just in case anyone here thinks that it's the best spiritual behavior in the history of AA at the conference. This is at the conference. I've heard a delegate say, why don't we take all those young people, gay people, and non-believers and just give them their own general service structure? When that delegate said that, I walked back to my seat and sat down because I knew I didn't need to say anything. He just won my argument for me. No one is going to vote on his side now with behavior like that. I don't need to say anything. So I know it's a hard lesson, and I know it might be sometimes people that like have a panel number and God knows what else, but I'm just telling you, if you align yourself with them, probably anything you bring forward, you got to be willing to call out their behavior. Like, yes, I agree with you, but you got to calm down with the rhetoric. You got to calm down with the ugly comments. How do you show the conference you have many people behind the proposed agenda item? Jimmy, I think you touched on this a little.
Yeah, for example, if the idea source is, let's just say, with you as an individual AA member, I believe it's always beneficial to see if you can get some support from your home group, support from the district in which your home group is participating, and then, if possible, have it put on as an agenda item in the area assembly. Um, just again, not so much about 500 people mean more than one person as it relates to the merits of the item, but we believe that that shows that a larger conscience of AA members has formed in support of the item. So they are considered. That is considered when items, hit the conference desk.
Thank you very much. The word removed at this year's conference also appears in AA Comes of Age. It also shows up in Language of the Heart. I believe it also shows up in As Bill Sees It. Will this word automatically be changed in all our literature now, or is it possible to send in an agenda item to maintain language? That is a great question for your delegate and your district. You are not restricted in what proposed agenda items you can send in. The history, though, is we follow the letter of the advisory action. If it says it to remove only from one piece of literature, that is what we do. If the other literature that you're talking about is conference approved, it will take a conference action to remove it. It could be a general conference action that says remove it everywhere it appears in conference approved literature, or it could be book by book. If you want to maintain language, that would go back to the discussion on the founder's writing, which apparently is going to be discussed more in the next year or two. But I just want to encourage you to send in agenda items to talk to your delegate. Yes, we can stop screen share now, and you can swipe out of screen share too. Jimmy, you want to handle this? How is background put together? Where do they find the information? And how come some information sometimes gets left out?
So the staff secretary for the trustees committee that has initially received the item is going to go back into archives at GSO and other binders full of conference background from prior years in order to find every pertinent piece of material related to that particular suggestion. Now, as background continued to grow, we got up to where delegates were receiving 13, 14, 1,500 pieces of paper background for all the committees, not just their committees, but even in electronic form on a dashboard, it was becoming unwieldy. Then the trustees committees, the last year that I was trustee, began a process of trying to remove duplicate information. In other words, if it was in two different places in the background, attempting to get the committee get your conference committee chair to secretary, excuse me, to remove it. But I've not seen any intentional piece of material that related to the item left out, because the background that the conference committee is receiving is the same background that the trustees committee had received earlier in the conference year in order to do the work that it needed to do, and or write a report around it as a cover letter of sorts to the committee, or whatever else that they needed to do. It is possible that the culling out, which has only been done the last 4 years, 3 or 4 years, maybe we're a little overzealous with some of that around certain things. And if it's a topic that's been discussed multiple times in prior conferences, we also had a period of time where some of those 3-ring binders, and Billy will remember the binders, not all of that material was imaged. In other words, prior to PDFs and prior to TIFFs, when documents weren't electronic, a lot of that conference background was in the process of being scanned. And archives takes the responsibility for most of that work, and that is, I would say, a small but incredibly overworked department at GSO. Yeah, they got a lot of things going, but I believe all of it's finally imaged now.
Thank you. Next question is, so it seems to me the only way to safeguard the 164 pages and include the fellowship in such a decision is to amend the charter, Article 3, to include the first 164 pages in addition to the steps, traditions, and Article 12 of the conference charter. Is that correct? Yes. If you feel you'd like to send in a proposed agenda item to add that to the conference charter, that's what you should do. Since our group doesn't have a GSR, how can I personally submit a proposed agenda item to the General Service Office to oppose the new corporate code of conduct? Well, you can submit any agenda item you want. You could write it on a napkin with a crayon. You could use the form. But I think the best thing you could do, and I don't say this condescending at all, is for your group to have a GSR and to become fully informed and to become connected to the middle of AA. At the conference, who decides to decline a floor action? When the floor action is read by the motion maker and receives a second, well, once it's seconded, the person is allowed to read it and then it's seconded, but then somebody can make a motion not to decline. That can be any voting member of the General Service Conference. So one of the 93 delegates, one of the 22 trustees, one of the 6 directors, one of the 15 or 16 staff members that are voting members. Somebody wrote, the Big Book and 12 and 12 are under the purview of the conference, right? All other books are under the purview of AAWS? No, that's not correct. If the book says this is AA conference approved literature, AWS only has limited authority by the publishing policy to make format changes and minor edits like punctuation and things like that. The Big Book and the 12 and 12 are not the only items that are protected by the conference. Let's see. Okay, hopefully the screen share is shut off. There's another question here about, can you add to the conference charter? Yes, of course. You have to send it in as a PAI. There's another question here about the resolution. The resolution is truly for those of you that like to play late night service manual Jeopardy. The resolution has not been interpreted by the conference. That's the best I could say about it. It's in the service manual. It does make clear about the 75% and changing the traditions when that was originally written, because the first conference charter only protected the traditions. The problem with that resolution, we have had very few proposals to change a tradition. One of the last ones was the 11th tradition short form to add, which seems funny now, that the phrase new media technology like the internet. By the way, only Alcoholics Anonymous was calling the internet new media technology in 2012, but uh, here's the issue. I'll just share my experience with that. I would not have voted to change the tradition, not because I'm afraid of change and not because I don't think it would be a good idea for people to see that the internet is as much anonymous place as a newspaper, but because we have never solidified the process of what we would do. Because if you read the resolution in the service manual, it uses the plural of all registered groups of all general service offices, not just US and Canada. So we have never, ever put together a process approved by the conference of how we would go about changing a tradition or now a step or Article 12. Because there are some people that feel very strongly it's the purview of the US and Canada, but the resolution implies that it should include all registered groups in the world. So whoever sent in that comment and question, it is a great debate that has not been settled by any conference yet. Okay, hold on. Is there any last questions here? It feels to me like unchecked authority to not have the entire conference have an opportunity to decide its own agenda. I realize that's not an easy feat. Has it always been this way? No. Um, if you talk to your delegate and other people and you read the history and actions of the General Service Conference, the conference did have a lot more input in agenda items. And then it fell to the trustees later on. If you look at other general service structures, like when we got a Class B General Service Board chair, even Jimmy served as an interim General Service Board chair as a Class B. We now have a permanent Class B for 4 years. A lot of people got all freaked out, but like foreign structures have mostly only had Class B trustees as chairs of their General Service Board. Bill W. himself was the one who told them to make him alcoholic. And a lot of the documents when we accepted that we could have a Class B chair were old things that Bill wrote. But other general service conferences, like I was just in Australia, a conference committee decides on the agenda items. And it's a delegate who's a chair of that committee. I happened to be there on their deadline date, and I found it super interesting. And I think that's also important to know. Like, it's funny because I just had golf cart number 62, Rule 62, but we never talk about AA service Rule 63, which is this is the way we've always done it. I hope anyone who's new to service here is not afraid of new ideas and bringing new ideas forward. It's kind of like our death nail in AA service. We're out there telling people we need more people in service. But then if they bring a new idea, God forbid they committed like a Class A AA felony. Like, we just needed you to do the work. We didn't need you to bring you new ideas. Like, it should be broadcast loud. If you have a better way of doing something, then submit an agenda item.
Right. And that process, again, the conference agenda committee from 51 till 74, 5 And the old Brown service manual outlined the process as they were the recipients of suggestions, and they basically determined, how they would be programmed. Now, I can see how trustees during the year uh, fulfill a role in shepherding items along, but it seems to me of late there's been some momentum around the joint meetings, which did not exist when you or I were delegates, right? Joint meetings between trustees, committee chair, and the conference committee chair or the full committee. And now I think the conference committee chair people are going to the October board weekend instead of the January board weekend. And October really is where everything, for the most part, is getting processed or programmed. So there was a suggestion a few years ago. I don't remember if it made it to a conference committee or not. It certainly wasn't voted on at the conference, but there was a suggestion where basically if the trustees had said there was no express need, or let's just say they turned back the suggestion, that there would be a delegate committee discussion around that item. And if the committee felt like that it should be heard, the committee basically had let's just say, the right to override, which I guess from the upside down triangle perspective makes sense, because the conference committees certainly do sit above the board of trustees and the general service office and the corporate boards for that matter. So, yeah.
So there's another question here about, and I think it's a really good one, and there's another question here that's almost the same question, so I'll try to put them together. But it is an interesting question about how many times have we moved back the PAI deadline, and how come the groups still get the same amount of time to review the agenda items and background? That is an awesome question. I want to thank the person who asked that. When I was a delegate, January 15th was the deadline. And then it was moved back into December, moved back into November. Now it's in September. But yet we still give groups 1 or 1.5 business meeting cycle between February and April to review the agenda. Like, we keep moving it back, but the one part of the fellowship we haven't given more time is the short amount of time we give groups in February and March to actually review the agenda. There's a quick question here. Are Grapevine books approved by the conference? So it's an easy answer, no. Grapevine books are not original books. They are reprints of articles that were already published in the Grapevine. The Grapevine is our official magazine. It would be impossible to approve every edition every month. So we recognize it as the conference-approved official magazine and meeting and print of Alcoholics Anonymous, and now podcast and whatever else. But anything that's in a Grapevine book is something that was already published inside a Grapevine magazine.
Good question. The Language of the Heart is a conference-approved piece of material. Was it conference-approved, Language of the Heart? The compilation of all of Bill's articles, or no? No.
No. Okay, maybe this is the best question to end on, because it's so open-ended that it can't be answered. Will this change to this one word open the door to change other verbiage found in the founder's writing? I think it's easiest to not take an opinion on any changes and just say, what does the current literature say? If the conference wants to make a change, they can change it. That's in their authority. If the conference literature committee or somebody on that committee wants to bring an item of new business without submitting it as a PAI, whether they meant intentionally or unintentionally went around the process of submitting a PAI, whichever it was, if you don't like any of that process, you have to submit something to change that process. But based on your question, will it open the door? The door is open. the conference has the right to change conference-approved literature. The conference trustees, the conference literature committee, has the right to add an item of new business on there, even if it wasn't on their agenda. So if you go by what's written, which is the easiest thing to do in AA service, go to what is written. Then whoever asked this question, it's not will this change or open the door. The door was open when the delegates went to the conference this year. It's the process that currently exists. And if you're upset with that, I'm not going to take away your right to being upset. Just going to ask you to do it in a cordial manner and make sure your group is going to your district and to your area and send in a PAI. Jimmy, anything last you want to say?
No, I just would echo what you shared around that we we should all know what tools are available to us. And I think for closing, I'd like to reiterate that the first concept tells us that final responsibility and ultimate authority rests in the groups of Alcoholics Anonymous, and not that we need to, bandy about loosely what that ultimate authority looks like. But it seems to me that the level of patronization and condescension is unrecognizable to me with 27 or 28 years in service in Alcoholics Anonymous. Trusted servants, by definition in AA, understand spiritually to whom they are directly accountable. And I hope that, again, civilly as AA members, but that we're not told that we can't ask a question or that the question is not, relevant to some particular topic or subject. I really like it that you stressed that nothing confidential happens in the conference. And by the way, Billy may have different experience, but my experience as a trustee and as an AWS board member, very little confidential stuff happens at that level either. Human resources information, of course, confidential. Active litigation, confidential. But some of this stuff that comes out about minutes being confidential and all this other kind of stuff, I just don't have any point of reference for any of that. So I think that's all I need to say about that. But thanks.
I think the one place maybe people are getting the confidential thing from is on works that are in progress, meaning a book that's in draft. It only goes out to the conference literature committee, not all the members of the conference. It's only once the literature committee approves it that then other members of the conference are given a couple of nights to read it this time. And that's to prevent it getting published before it's actually published. And I'll just encourage people that just because it's the way we've always done it doesn't make it right. Something new isn't always bad. Something old isn't always bad. But something bigger isn't always better. I'm looking at the service manual right here. I mean, here it is. It has everything you could want to read. But yet it's too big to mail to GSRs now because it's too expensive. See, when I was a GSR and I registered, I got a service manual in the mail. It's in my office. And so we keep adding to this. Soon it'll have a Velcro cover on, like the one in the back of your car trunk for your car that you operate, right? But it's too expensive to mail. And so I worry about the new GSR, like we have to take care of the new GSR. But all new ideas are welcome. Please send them in. And I thank everyone for coming here tonight. The information for the WhatsApp chat will go, if you want to be added to that recording group, you will be added if you send a message. And I want to thank everyone who is involved in service, because sometimes we spend too much time talking about the groups that don't participate or the people that don't participate. And it's so disrespectful to the people who sacrifice so much out of their life, like they don't count. Like so many people sacrifice so much time out of their life for Alcoholics Anonymous. Do we want more people to participate? Of course. But we should maybe more celebrate and embrace the people who are participating instead of focusing on the people who are not there. So we will close with the responsibility statement. Jimmy, thank you very much for showing up tonight.
Thanks for inviting me. Thank you.
I am responsible
Responsible.
when anyone, anywhere reaches out for help. I want the hand of AA always to be there.
And
For that, I am
I'm
responsible.
responsible.
Have
to
a good
see
night,
y'all.
everyone. Thank you. It'll be kept open so you can get that WhatsApp number to add to the Monday night group if you want the recordings for a little while.